Now, governance expert Professor Alex van den Heever is joining us for this discussion. Prof, thank you for your time and for joining us this evening. Let's maybe start off by talking about the timing. So 2 years ago, Shamila Batohi had requested to the president to look into the conduct of Advocate Chauke, requesting that maybe he should be put on special leave. But it was only after the July 6 address, seemingly, when the National Commissioner as well as General Mkhwanazi had accused Chauke for being a part of organized crime. Now, this comparison was made in the ad hoc committee by the Action SA's MP Darlene James, saying that it seems as though the president was only pushed to this decision to suspend Chauke only after the allegations were made by General Mkhwanazi. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's hard to understand this timeline, because this is a case that involves that can involve very serious risks for the justice system, because prosecutors have significant discretion as to whether or not to pursue cases or not to pursue them. And this is a case where he is being attacked for doing both, not pursuing certain cases that he should have and pursuing cases that he shouldn't have, against advice and against evidence. And when the only way to essentially proceed to remove such a person is with the president's exercise of his discretion. And to take 2 years to respond is not really acceptable, when basically many serious crimes can be interfered with by such a person.
And I mean, you speak about the discretion that prosecutors have. Maybe just talk to us about those key ethical principles that should be guiding prosecutors when it comes to making decisions, especially when it also involves political individuals or politically connected individuals.
So they should be acting without fear or favor. They should be acting objectively and in the public interest. They should be operating in terms of procedure and evidence. And they should not be influenced by any party to make any decision. So the whole idea of giving people a discretion is because in such a matter you do have to apply your mind, and you do have to think through complex cases and evidence and issues. But the idea of giving such discretion isn't to allow somebody to act in the private interest of any party. And that can be the case of a politician who wants them to do something in their favor, or some other private interest, or a gangster. So the idea of that, the exercise of that discretion, is not to exercise it in an improper manner. So this is a case where the only way to get, or at least one critical way to get such a person with such discretion to be reviewed for potentially not being a person of appropriate integrity and for having made poor decisions, is to get the president to act. So the whole idea is you shouldn't be allowed to use your discretion in an improper manner. And if you do so, there should be consequences. So this is the consequence that should arise for the improper exercise of a discretion. That is essentially the allegation that's being made, and it was made by the National Director of Public Prosecutions. It's a very critical person to do that. And merely making the allegation doesn't mean that the person is automatically removed. It means that there has to be a process of investigating the matter. So what the president has done is the thing that he should have done 2 years ago, which is to appoint an inquiry where a judge and a process, a quasi-judicial process, which is what this is, would actually look at the facts and reach a determination as to whether or not this person should continue in their position. And that's the process we have. So the president should have done that. That's the only way to deal with this. But there must be consequences for people who are given such wide discretion and then abuse it.
So, Prof, from a governance perspective, what systemic weaknesses do you think possibly could exist within the NPA that may have facilitated or failed to prevent this alleged misconduct by Advocate Chauke?
I think we have to start looking at the processes involved in the appointment of people into the various senior positions of the public prosecutor. This includes the National Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as the provincial heads. This also goes to the commissioners of police the provincial commissioners, as well as the national commissioner and the deputy commissioners. So all of these, there is essentially a member of the executive who has wide discretion of appointment. And part of that discretion is whether or not they actually have a proper process to appoint them or to remove them. This is where there were a lot of court cases about the questionable removal of key people from the Hawks, from IPAD, and so on. So the issue here is that we do have to look at how people are appointed, and it appears as though we're appointing people of questionable integrity into these positions where people exercise enormous discretion. Because if you have anybody who's a bad apple in that position, there are significant consequences for a myriad of processes that are very difficult to reverse. They both impact on the quality of the organization they're running, as well as on key decisions. This is whether or not it's the Hawks, the regional police services, the national police functions. All of them are affected by this kind of appointment process. We are not necessarily vetting the people who go into these top positions properly, and we're having to deal with retrospectively with them. This goes to the Mdlulis and all of them who've been extremely problematic. Yeah. And we've had it for years with commissioners of police and national directors of public prosecutions. Very questionable appointments because of the excessive discretion that has been exercised by the executive. Even if it is an appointment that must be made by the executive, there should be a statutory framework in place for the processes that they must go through to make that appointment. We can't leave it up to somebody to say, oh, well, I decide at this point to have a panel and I choose everybody on that panel, which is currently happening for the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. That is where the error lies.
And of course, I mean, that appointment needs to take place very soon. The president a week ago had announced the committee that would sit together and make the recommendations to him, with some political parties raising some of those issues that you're saying with regards to who sits on that committee, and eventually would the person who is appointed as NDPP not feel some kind of allegiance to those that sit on a committee and select them?
Yeah, it's a question as to whether or not there's some sort of quid pro quo. There could be a whole host of reasons why the wrong person is appointed. One can be that there's a relationship. You see, the problem with senior members of the executive is that they actually have considerable power, and they can abuse that power in exactly the way that a public prosecutor can abuse their power. And therefore they can be pursued by the police and by the prosecutorial authorities. And so it's in their interest to have somebody there who's going to turn a blind eye. So you can't have people who hold positions of authority that have systemic consequences for the country. You cannot have those people make these appointments in an arbitrary, well, not arbitrary manner, in a manner in which they can basically establish a conflict of interest in the appointment. So all we really have to do is to establish statutory processes for how these positions are appointed and vetted. We can't leave it up to the discretion of the president, parliament, or anybody to just decide. It's got to be a proper process that has been worked through and allows for independent vetting, nomination, appointment, removal. All of those functions need to be in that legislative framework, regardless of what the Constitution says. That's the final appointment. But basically, the president shouldn't be able to cherry pick their guy to put in these positions.
So coming back to the inquiry, tomorrow the NDPP will be the first witness, Advocate Shamila Batohi, and she's made a request saying that she would like to give evidence in one sitting, meaning that she will present her evidence and then also directly face questions from Chauke's team thereafter, with the evidence leader, Advocate Mahlominyane, saying that they're not comfortable with this process taking place in this way. In fact, it was the judge Nkabinde who responded in saying that it's not for Batohi to decide for when she wants to answer questions. Why do you think she has chosen for or requested for this process to happen in that particular way?
So from the National Director of Public Prosecutions, it is an understandable request, because sometimes in a complex matter, it's easier to give your evidence and your argument in a logical fashion, in a sort of a continuous narrative. You're leading your evidence, essentially. And that if it's basically interrupted all the time, it can break it up and break up the logic. That would be one basic reason for arguing for the one versus the other. The court, the judge may have decided that basically, as an allegation is made, it is better to address it at the point at which it is made, and if there are questions and issues that need to be asked at that point. So both have an argument. And one will see how it pans out. But at the end of the day, I think the evidence must stand on its own 2 feet. And it's whether or not you tell the story in a continuous narrative or whether or not you're interrupted as you give it, it shouldn't really matter at the end of the day.
So lastly, Prof, I mean, at the heart of many of these inquiries and commissions are those allegations made by General Mkhwanazi with regards to the infiltration, be it in SAPS or in the criminal justice system in its entirety. What do you think are the broader societal implications of prosecutorial misconduct in terms of justice, human rights, and just democratic accountability?
So they're very severe. They're more severe than the odd CIT robbery, because these are people in positions that are able to divert huge resources within the state in different directions, and also to steal. And if they are basically able to act without accountability, the damage that is done to both the quality of government is affected by the kind of people who would do that. They make bad decisions. They don't make decisions in the interests of society. The policies are weak and bad. And then the resources of the state are stolen. And the more they feel that that there's impunity to any kind of prosecution, the worse it gets. That in itself then creates networks of people who interact with them on the outside, and it basically creates an iron triangle. It becomes very difficult to remove this set of relationships, and it can be severely harmful down the line, as basically the democratic state is systematically unwound through these relationships. So you have to basically hold the line at this level of society. These are the most serious crimes that can be committed in the country. So they have to have the highest focus and the most independence of prosecutors and investigators dealing with it. And they cannot be interfered with by anybody who has skin in the game in the final decision.
Most certainly. Prof, before I let you go, we do have a caller on the line. We've got Ronald in Louis Trichardt. Ronald, a very good evening to you. What's your question or comment this evening?
Good evening, my sister. How are you?
Good, thanks. And what's your take this evening, Ronald, on what we're discussing?
Yes, I'm surprised. The other case which is not included is the case of Zizi Godwa, because the same person is the one who bargained that the case must not continue.
The case of Zizi Godwa?
Yes, because he's the same person who conducting the inquiry is the one who let the case that must not continue.
All right, Ronald, thank you for your input this evening. Prof, maybe let's get your intake on that. The case of Zizi Godwa, Ronald in Louis Trichardt saying that he's surprised that is not seeing the light of day.
Well, I don't know enough about the detail of that particular matter, but this raises the question is that the moment you're dealing with senior politicians and have their cases withdrawn, people no longer trust the justice system. They don't trust the prosecutors. And we basically have to be in a position where structurally these organizations are independent so that they're above question. You don't just put your trust in an institution that is so easily captured. You've got to be able to trust an organization which is properly ring-fenced from vested interests. We don't have that at the moment. It doesn't mean that many prosecutors and many policemen don't carry out their duties appropriately, but it becomes incredibly difficult for the ones that are honest when more and more of them are taken over by people who are conflicted. So yeah, we do have to be able to trust in the decisions of the prosecuting authorities, the police, and the justice system.